She was married, legally, officially, bindingly married. A contract had been signed. Witnesses had confirmed it. The law was clear, and the next morning she woke up in her parents' house, on the same sleeping mat, in the same room, next to the same mother she had slept beside her entire life. Her husband was 50 meters away on the other side of the village, sleeping in his family's house. And he would stay there, and she would stay here for almost a year. Not because something was wrong, because that was the system. A strange, deliberate, built-in pause between the legal marriage and the actual marriage, between belonging to someone on paper and belonging to someone in life. This is the year nobody talks about, the year between two homes. The Jewish marriage system in the 1st century had two distinct phases separated by a waiting period that could last up to a year. Phase 1, Erusin, the legal betrothal, a binding contract sealed with an object of value and confirmed by witnesses. From this moment, the couple was married under Jewish law. Dissolving the union required a formal bill of divorce, a get. If the groom died during the waiting period, the bride was considered a widow, not merely an ex-fiancée. The legal bond was absolute. Phase 2, Nisuin, the formal wedding ceremony which culminated in the bride physically moving from her father's house to her husband's home. This was the moment when the marriage became complete, legally, socially, and physically. The couple would begin living together. The marriage would be consummated. Between these two phases, a gap. The Mishnah in Tractate Ketubot 5.2 specifies the standard waiting period. For a virgin bride, the interval was 12 months from the time the betrothal was requested. For a widow being remarried, it was 30 days. The Mishnah even adds that if the waiting period expired and the wedding hadn't happened through no fault of the bride, she was entitled to be maintained from the groom's resources. The gap was not accidental. It served specific functions. The bride needed time to prepare her trousseau, her clothing, and personal items for the new household. The groom needed time to prepare the living space, and the community needed time to verify that the bride was indeed a virgin, a requirement that carried enormous legal and social weight. For Mary and Joseph, this gap meant something very specific. Mary was Joseph's wife. Joseph was Mary's husband. And yet they lived in separate houses on separate sides of a village so small you could shout from one house and be heard at the other. The day started before dawn. It had to. There was too much work for the hours of daylight, and none of it could be skipped. The first task every day was the grinding stone. Barley was the primary grain in rural Galilee, cheaper and hardier than wheat, though wheat was used when available. The grain was stored in clay jars, kept dry and rationed carefully through the year. Each morning enough kernels for the day's bread had to be ground into flour by hand. The grinding was done on a basalt saddle quern, or a rotary hand mill, a pair of circular stones, the upper one fitted with a wooden handle and turned by hand over the fixed lower stone. The kernels were fed into a hole in the center of the upper stone and ground into flour as the stone rotated. The process took between 1 and 2 hours for a single family's daily supply. It was heavy work. The upper stone weighed 3 to 5 kilograms. The motion was repetitive, circular, constant, hard on the wrists and shoulders. Archaeological analysis of female skeletal remains from ancient Near Eastern sites consistently shows arthritis in the wrists, shoulders, and lower back, the physical signature of a lifetime of daily grinding. Mary did this every morning. She had been doing it since she was old enough to grip the handle, probably since she was 7 or 8 years old. By now, in her early 20s, the calluses were permanent. The motion was automatic. Her body knew the rhythm the way her lungs knew how to breathe. She ground the flour. She added water and a pinch of salt from the evaporation ponds near the Dead Sea, traded through regional markets. She kneaded the dough on a flat stone. She pressed it into thin rounds. She baked it in the tabun, the dome-shaped clay oven in the courtyard, fired with dried animal dung and brushwood. By the time the sun was fully up, the bread was done. Then water. The walk to the village spring. The jar filled 15 liters, roughly 15 kilograms. The walk back up the hill, sometimes twice in a morning if the family's storage jars were low. Then the rest, mending, spinning, sweeping, tending the small courtyard garden, feeding the animals a goat, a few chickens, preparing the midday meal, washing clothes in a stone basin with water and wood ash lye. This was Mary's morning, every morning, including the morning after her betrothal, including every morning of the year-long waiting period. The Arusin had changed her legal status. It had not changed a single thing about her daily work. While Mary ground flour, Joseph built walls. The standard arrangement in first-century Galilee was the insula, a connected housing compound where extended family members lived around a shared courtyard. When a son married, he typically added a room to the existing family structure. Sometimes, this meant building onto the back or side of his parents' house. Sometimes it meant constructing a small freestanding structure within the same courtyard. Joseph's new room, Mary's future home, would have been modest, based on excavated domestic structures from the period we can estimate roughly 2.5 meters by 3 meters, 8 by 10 feet. A single room. The walls were limestone. The local geology provided an abundant supply. The hills around Nazareth are composed of Eocene-era limestone and chalk, soft enough to quarry with hand tools but hard enough to build with. Joseph would have cut blocks from a nearby outcrop, roughed them into rectangular shapes with a chisel and mallet, and stacked them in courses with a mortar of local clay and lime. Wall thickness, approximately 0.5 meter. Thick enough to provide insulation, keeping the interior cool in summer and retaining warmth from a small fire or oil lamp in winter. The interior surface would have been left rough or given a thin coat of lime plaster, a mixture of burned limestone powder and water applied wet and allowed to harden. The doorway low, perhaps 1.5 meters, framed with larger cut stones as a lintel and jambs. The door itself, if there was one, would have been a wooden plank, or more likely a heavy woven curtain or an animal hide. The roof was the most complex part. Wooden beams, sycamore oak or whatever was locally available, laid across the top of the walls, spaced about 0.5 meter apart. Over the beams, a layer of smaller branches and reeds. Over that, a thick layer of mud and straw tamped down and sealed. This roof required annual maintenance. After the winter rains, it had to be retamped and rolled with a heavy stone cylinder, a tool that archaeologists have found at multiple Galilean sites to compress the surface and prevent leaking. A good roof was the difference between a livable room and a wet, miserable room. Joseph, as a tekton, knew this better than anyone. How long did the construction take? Working alone, or with occasional help from family members, and working only in the hours before and after his daily labor at Sepphoris, the project likely took months. Every evening, after walking 6 kilometers home from the construction site, Joseph had a second construction project waiting for him, the room where his wife would live. Here's the part that's hardest to explain to a modern audience. In a village of 200 people with a single water source, a single synagogue, and a network of footpaths that everyone shared, Mary and Joseph saw each other constantly. They had to. There was no way to avoid it. She saw him leaving for Sepphoris at dawn. He saw her at the spring in the afternoon. They both sat in the synagogue every Shabbat hymn, with the men on one side, her with the women on the other, separated by the width of the room, but breathing the same air, hearing the same Torah, reading, existing within 15 feet of each other for hours. They may have exchanged words, brief, public, appropriate. Shalom. A nod. A glance that lasted a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The Mishnah does not explicitly prohibit communication between betrothed couples during the waiting period, but the social norms were clear. Physical contact was forbidden, and extended private conversation would have been inappropriate. So they existed in a strange suspension, married but separate, bound but apart, close enough to see each other's faces, but far enough by custom, by expectation, by the watchful eyes of 200 neighbors that they couldn't actually know each other. Every Shabbat in the synagogue. Mary could hear Joseph's voice when the congregation spoke together. Every evening at the spring, Joseph could see Mary's silhouette against the late light. Every morning the sound of his footsteps on the path toward Sepphoris would have been audible from her courtyard. They were learning each other's rhythms without ever sharing a room. They were becoming familiar with the shape of each other's days without ever being part of them. This is what betrothal felt like. Not the excitement of a new relationship, not the comfort of a shared home. Just proximity, just awareness, just the slow accumulation of small observations, the way he walks, the way she carries the jar, the way he pauses at the doorway, the way she tucks her head covering when the wind catches it, stored up and filed away, building a picture of a person you belong to but don't yet know. The village watched. That was not optional. In Nazareth, watching was the primary form of entertainment, social regulation, and community bonding. The women at the spring would have monitored Mary's behavior with forensic attention. Was she acting differently since the Arusin? Was she spending more time near Joseph's side of the village? Had anyone seen them talking? Was she carrying herself like a woman who was happy with the match, or like a woman who was enduring it? The men, too, would have observed Joseph. Was the room coming along? Was he using good stone? Was the mortar holding a man who couldn't build a decent room for his wife, was a man who couldn't be trusted with larger responsibilities? Joseph's construction project was not just a building, it was a public performance of his competence. And both families were being evaluated as well. Had the mohar been fair? Was the ketubah generous? Were the families getting along, or were there tensions? In a village where every family's fortunes were intertwined, where you might need your neighbor's help during harvest or his ox during plowing season. A marriage that caused friction between two families affected everyone. Mary navigated all of this. Every trip to the spring, every Shabbat at the synagogue, every interaction with the village women who had known her since birth, and who now looked at her with a slightly different quality of attention, the attention reserved for a woman who is about to leave one household and enter another. She was being evaluated, not cruelly, or at least not necessarily cruelly, but constantly. Would she be a good wife? Could she manage a household? Would she give Joseph sons? Would she bring honor or trouble to both families? In a village of 200, the answers to these questions were not private, they were public property, and Mary lived inside that public gaze every single day of the waiting period. As the months passed and the Nisuin approached, the texture of Mary's days began to shift. She would have been preparing practical items for her new household clothing linens, whatever a poor family could provide. The Mishnah mentions the bride's trousseau as a standard expectation, though for a family of Mary's means it would have been minimal. A second tunic, a heavier cloak for winter, a head covering, perhaps a few small household items, a clay lamp, a wooden bowl, a small storage jar. Her mother would have been teaching her the things a new wife needed to know, the specific rhythms of maintaining a household independently without a mother's help, how to judge when the taban was the right temperature, how to stretch a supply of flour through a lean week, how to repair a cracked water jar with pine pitch, how to bank a fire overnight. The practical curriculum of survival passed from mother to daughter across thousands of years. These were the last months of daily contact between Mary and Anna. After the Nisuin, Mary would move to Joseph's house 50 meters away, but in the daily reality of a working woman's life, that distance meant a fundamental separation. She would no longer grind grain with her mother every morning. She would no longer sleep beside her. She would no longer be the first face Anna saw at dawn. The approaching separation was not dramatic. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. Every daughter left eventually. Every mother watched her go. But ordinary doesn't mean painless. And the silence between two women who know a goodbye is coming, the silence while they sit on a rooftop and watch the sun go down and don't say the thing they're both thinking. That silence has its own weight. The year between Arusin and Nisuin was designed to be practical. Time for the bride to prepare. Time for the groom to build. Time for the families to settle the arrangements. But what it actually was in the lived reality of two people in a tiny village was a long, strange exercise in parallel living. Two people bound by law, separated by custom, orbiting each other at close range without ever quite connecting, learning each other from a distance, building a shared future in separate rooms. Mary ground flour. Joseph stacked stones. Mary walked to the spring. Joseph walked to Sepphoris. Mary sewed cloth by lamplight. Joseph fit roof beams by fading daylight. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary, repetitive, unglamorous work, somewhere in the accumulation of 1,000 small observations made across 50 meters of village footpath, something was forming between them. Not love necessarily. Not yet. Maybe just familiarity. Maybe just the slow recognition of a shape that fits. Or maybe not even that. Maybe just two people doing what their world required of them, building what needed to be built, preparing what needed to be prepared, waiting for a date that the families would eventually set. Either way, the waiting period was almost over. The room was nearly finished. The Nisuin was approaching. And then before the wedding could happen, before Mary could cross those 50 meters for the last time and move into the room Joseph had built, everything changed. But that's the next story.